Joseph James DeAngelo, later unmasked as the Golden State Killer, lived a double life that stunned investigators and the public. For decades, California communities were terrorized by a series of break-ins, assaults, and killings that seemed to defy resolution. What no one realized at the time was that the man responsible had once sworn an oath to uphold the law. DeAngelo served as a police officer in the 1970s, working in small departments where he gained both access to law enforcement procedures and an insider's understanding of how investigations unfolded. That knowledge allowed him to exploit gaps in policing, helping him stay ahead of detectives for years. The crime spree began in the mid-1970s with a string of home invasions in the Sacramento area. Victims described a masked man who carefully studied their routines and neighborhoods, slipping into homes with unnerving precision. In many cases, he tied up the occupants, stole small personal items, and lingered long enough to inflict psychological damage that lasted a lifetime. As his confidence grew, his offenses spread into other counties across California, leaving investigators puzzled by the sheer scale and sophistication of the attacks. Despite the hundreds of witnesses, leads, and reports, no arrest was ever made. In time, the series of incidents expanded beyond property crimes and assaults. Whole families were shaken, and communities lived in fear of an intruder who seemed unstoppable. Local police forces worked tirelessly, but DeAngelo's training and planning made him unusually difficult to catch. He knew how to avoid leaving behind obvious evidence, and he often taunted officers by calling victims or investigators, reminding them that he was still free. His reign of terror stretched from 1974 to 1986 before suddenly stopping, leaving an unresolved trail of destruction and unanswered questions. For decades, the case grew cold. Detectives retired, and communities tried to move forward. Yet the memory of the Golden State Killer remained. What ultimately broke the silence was the rise of forensic genealogy. Investigators uploaded crime scene DNA to an online database used for tracing family history, eventually narrowing the pool of suspects to DeAngelo. In 2018, after decades of uncertainty, he was arrested outside his home in Sacramento. In court, DeAngelo was confronted by survivors and families of those he had harmed. At 74 years old, he admitted responsibility for a staggering list of offenses, providing closure to cases that had haunted California for more than 40 years. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mikhail Popkov was not the kind of man anyone in Angarsk, Russia, would have suspected of living a double life. Born in 1964, he grew up to wear the uniform of a police officer, a role that carried respect and trust. To neighbors and colleagues, he was reliable, steady, and even ordinary. At home, he was a husband and father. Nothing about his outward appearance suggested the dark secret he was keeping from those closest to him. In the early 1990s, when Russia was undergoing massive social and economic changes, Popkov began to act on urges that would make him one of the most feared figures in the country's history. Late at night, he would cruise the quiet streets of Angarsk in his police car. Women, often stranded or vulnerable, saw him as a safe option for a ride home. That trust became his tool. Once they stepped inside his vehicle, the chance of escape disappeared. Popkov's background in law enforcement gave him a unique advantage. He knew how investigations worked, how evidence was collected, and most importantly, how to avoid being caught. Bodies began appearing in forests, fields, and remote areas, and investigators struggled to piece together the pattern. The brutality of the attacks suggested more than one person was responsible. Few could imagine that one of their own, a man sworn to protect, was behind it. For nearly 2 decades, Popkov lived this double existence. By day, he was the picture of normalcy. By night, he hunted. His ability to remain undetected for so long left his community haunted by unanswered questions. Fear spread as women were warned not to walk alone. Yet the crimes continued. The city carried an unshakable sense of dread. And still, no one suspected the quiet officer who blended so easily into everyday life. It was only with the rise of DNA technology that the net finally began to close. In 2012, investigators obtained a sample that matched evidence from one of the victims. The discovery broke open the case. When confronted, Popkov eventually confessed not just to a handful of crimes, but to more than 70. Each new admission painted an even darker picture of how many lives he had destroyed. Daniel Holtzclaw seemed to have the kind of story people admired. Born in 1986, he grew up playing football and eventually earned a spot on the roster at Eastern Michigan University. After college, he set aside athletics and pursued a career in law enforcement, joining the Oklahoma City Police Department. To those around him, he appeared driven, disciplined, and eager to prove himself as a young officer. But behind that professional image was a pattern of behavior that would later expose one of the most unsettling scandals in modern policing. In 2013, Holtzclaw began targeting women during his late-night patrol shifts. Many of these women lived on the margins of society, struggling with addiction, financial hardship, or prior arrests. Holtzclaw seemed to know that their voices carried less weight in a courtroom and used that vulnerability to his advantage. Under the cover of routine stops, he pressured them into situations where they felt trapped, relying on his badge and authority to silence resistance. For a time, it worked. The women were hesitant to come forward, fearing disbelief or retaliation. But eventually, a few began to speak, and their stories echoed one another in troubling detail. What began as isolated complaints turned into a growing wave of allegations that investigators could no longer ignore. Internal Affairs took the first steps, but soon the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigations stepped in, gathering evidence and testimony that revealed the scope of Holtzclaw's actions. By 2014, Holtzclaw was arrested, and the case quickly gained national attention. His trial became a landmark moment, not just for Oklahoma City, but for the country, shining a spotlight on the intersection of policing, power, and vulnerability. Over the course of the proceedings, 13 women testified, their accounts forming a chillingly consistent picture of an officer who had systematically abused his authority. The prosecution argued that Holtzclaw deliberately chose victims who were least likely to be believed, counting on their histories to shield him from accountability. In December 2015, the jury reached its verdict. Holtzclaw was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 263 years in prison. The outcome sent shockwaves through the community and sparked broader discussions about oversight, accountability, and the responsibility of law enforcement to protect rather than exploit. Len Davis's rise and fall remains one of the most chilling stories of police corruption in America. A New Orleans Police Department officer during the early 1990s, Davis was known on the streets as RoboCop, a nickname reflecting both his aggressive behavior and the perception that he was untouchable. While wearing the badge, he was running an operation that mixed drug trafficking, violence, and outright abuse of his authority. By the time he was arrested, Davis had crossed lines that few imagined an officer would ever dare. At the core of his activities was his partnership with local cocaine dealers. Instead of arresting traffickers, Davis acted as their protector. He used patrol cars to shield shipments, tipped dealers off to investigations, and made sure rivals were pushed out. He demanded payoffs in exchange for this protection, and his officers often looked the other way out of fear or loyalty. For Davis, the badge became a tool for profit, not public service. His most infamous crime unfolded in 1994 after a woman named Kim Groves filed a complaint with Internal Affairs, reporting that she had witnessed Davis beat a teenager. Rather than face discipline, Davis treated the complaint as a threat to be eliminated. Through wiretaps, the FBI recorded him arranging with a known hitman, Paul Hardy, to have Groves killed. Just days later, Groves was gunned down outside her home. Davis's voice was later captured celebrating the act, calling it a good kill. It was the clearest evidence yet that he had weaponized his position to orchestrate violence. But Davis's wrongdoing went even deeper. Investigations later revealed that he had framed at least 5 people for killings, crimes he may have committed himself. He would use his access to crime scenes and reports to manipulate evidence, planting items or shaping testimony to ensure the blame fell on someone else. In some cases, Vulnerable men from poor neighborhoods were pressured into false confessions or convicted on flimsy evidence that Davis himself had manufactured. These wrongful convictions not only destroyed lives, but also diverted attention away from Davis's own involvement in violent crimes. In 1996, Davis was convicted under federal civil rights statutes for conspiring to deprive Groves of her rights under color of law. He was sentenced to death, the first active duty officer in U.S. history to receive that punishment. Years later, his sentence was reduced to life without parole. Michael F. Dowd's career in the NYPD is remembered as one of the most blatant examples of police corruption in New York City history. Assigned to precincts in Brooklyn and Queens during the height of the crack epidemic in the 1980s, Dowd quickly realized the power of his position could make him far more money than his paycheck. What began as small favors for local drug dealers evolved into a full-fledged criminal partnership that lasted nearly a decade. Dowd's entry into corruption was straightforward. He accepted cash in exchange for protection. Dealers paid him to look the other way during street-level operations, and soon he was taking regular payments, sometimes thousands of dollars a week, from major drug crews. His police car and uniform provided cover for traffickers, allowing him to escort shipments without suspicion. In some instances, Dowd even transported narcotics himself, using the credibility of his badge to pass checkpoints unchallenged. As his connections deepened, Dowd became more than just a lookout. He supplied drug crews with intelligence from inside the department, including warnings about planned raids and the identities of undercover officers. He tipped off operations before they happened, giving traffickers time to move product or stash cash. When rival groups threatened his partners, Dowd acted as their enforcer, carrying his service weapon to intimidate or assault anyone who crossed them. His role blurred entirely into that of a criminal middleman with police authority. Dowd also participated directly in theft. He and other officers staged fake busts, seizing drugs or cash under the pretense of enforcement, only to divide the spoils. Some of the cocaine they confiscated was sold back into the market through the very dealers they were supposed to be arresting. At one point, Dowd was making so much money on the side that his police salary became irrelevant. His off-duty lifestyle, expensive cars, trips, and luxury items was a glaring contradiction to the modest income of an officer. But for years it went unchecked. The arrangement collapsed in the early 1990s when outside investigators, tipped off by his excessive spending and complaints from honest officers, uncovered his network. In 1992, Dowd was convicted of racketeering and drug conspiracy, sentenced to more than a decade in federal prison. Stephen Velasquez's case has become a textbook example of how internal loyalty and institutional self-protection can corrode the very foundation of public trust. A veteran lieutenant with the San Antonio Police Department, Velasquez had been seen as a steady hand within the ranks. But in February 2025, he was indicted on charges of tampering with public records tied to the 2023 shooting of Melissa Perez, a case that had already put the department under a microscope. Perez, a 46-year-old woman experiencing a mental health crisis, was shot inside her home after officers broke through a window during a standoff. Body-worn camera footage and community outcry pushed the department into a defensive posture, promising full transparency. Yet, behind the scenes, Velasquez was allegedly working to ensure that the paper trail told a different story. Prosecutors contend that Velasquez accessed internal investigative files related to the Perez shooting and altered them in ways that obscured responsibility. Specifically, he is accused of deleting or removing names, including his own and those of fellow officers, from official entries. In one report, he allegedly stripped identifying details about who authorized certain actions that night. In another, he edited the chain of command documentation so that accountability was muddled. Investigators believe these changes were not clerical corrections, but deliberate acts designed to shield colleagues and himself from scrutiny as lawsuits and potential criminal inquiries loomed. The tampering came to light when outside investigators cross-referenced Velasquez's reports with earlier drafts, CID logs, and officer statements. The discrepancies were stark. Timelines had been shifted, involvement minimized, and responsibility blurred. Forensic analysis of the department's computer system confirmed that Velasquez had personally made the edits, often late at night, after the case had already drawn media attention. Velasquez's actions led to a second indefinite suspension in May 2024, followed by a criminal investigation. On August 14, 2025, a Bezar County grand jury indicted him on a felony count of tampering with a government record, with intent to defraud or harm. He turned himself in, was briefly booked, and released on bond while awaiting arraignment. Keco Motton's story is one of the most disturbing examples of betrayal from within law enforcement. Once celebrated as Cedar Park's Officer of the Year, Motton had built a reputation as a reliable and dedicated officer. Beneath the recognition, however, he was carrying out a pattern of abuse that would eventually devastate lives and shatter trust in the department he represented. Between 2019 and 2023, Motton used his badge not to protect, but to prey on women who often had few resources to defend themselves. The women he targeted shared a common thread. Many were struggling with poverty, unstable housing, or past run-ins with the justice system. Motton recognized their vulnerabilities and exploited them. He frequently initiated contact under the guise of legitimate police duties, routine traffic stops, welfare checks, or follow-up visits tied to calls for service. Once he had them alone, the situation quickly shifted. Victims later described how he applied pressure in ways that left little room for refusal. He would suggest that resisting him could mean facing charges, losing custody of children, or enduring harassment from law enforcement. These implicit threats carried weight, especially when coming from an officer in uniform. At least one woman reported being assaulted while Motton was on duty. During that encounter, he used his position and authority to isolate her, then forced himself on her despite her protests. Others recalled unwanted contact during what were supposed to be routine interactions, where he blurred the lines between professional conduct and exploitation. Across different accounts, the methods were consistent: intimidation, manipulation, and leveraging the trust and fear that came with his badge. Complaints did surface, but they were brushed aside or not pursued with urgency. Each time Motton escaped consequences, it emboldened him further. Women who tried to speak up felt ignored or doubted, reinforcing his belief that he could continue unchecked. By the time investigators finally took action, a clear pattern had emerged. Multiple women describing eerily similar experiences of being cornered, coerced, and silenced. Motton's arrest in 2023 should have been a moment of accountability. Instead, it ended abruptly when took his own life shortly afterward, leaving his victims without the chance to see him face trial. Joseph Miedzianowski's rise as Chicago's most corrupt cop was not a sudden betrayal of the badge, but a calculated effort that spanned much of his career. He entered the Chicago Police Department in the late 1970s, earning a spot in the gang crimes unit, a post that gave him access to intelligence few others could see. With that position, he gained insight into ongoing investigations, surveillance tactics, and the movements of the city's most active gangs. Instead of using this information to stop criminal operations, he repurposed it to protect and expand his own network. One of Miedzianowski's main tactics was supplying gangs with weapons and drugs. He acted as both a shield and a resource, providing guns to bolster their power, while funneling cocaine into the neighborhoods he was supposed to patrol. At the same time, he made use of his authority to protect those same gangs. When he learned of impending raids or undercover operations, he leaked details so that dealers could move their product, hide evidence, or avoid being caught. By doing this, he bought himself loyalty from some of Chicago's most powerful street groups, effectively embedding himself within their operations. He also manipulated the system to eliminate competition. Miedzianowski would shake down rival dealers, those who were not aligned with him, demanding cash in exchange for being left alone. If they resisted, he could arrest them, plant evidence, or tip off other gangs to remove them from the street. This gave him leverage on both sides of the law. He appeared to his department as an officer taking down criminals, while in reality he was clearing the field for his own associates. To maintain his cover, Miedzianowski staged arrests that appeared legitimate. He occasionally busted low-level dealers, sometimes even ones he had supplied, to keep up appearances as a productive officer. This strategy helped him remain under the radar, even earning respect within the department for his supposed effectiveness against gang crime. Behind the scenes, though, he was orchestrating deals, coordinating shipments, and ensuring his chosen partners had free rein. By the 1990s, federal investigators began to see a pattern. Wiretaps, surveillance, and testimonies revealed how Miedzianowski straddled both worlds. He wasn't simply a corrupt cop who took bribes. He was actively managing a large-scale drug empire from within the police force. His use of insider knowledge, intimidation, and selective enforcement made him nearly untouchable for years. In 2001, Miedzianowski was convicted on multiple counts, including racketeering and conspiracy to distribute narcotics. He received a life sentence, one of the harshest penalties ever handed down to a police officer in the United States. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video interesting, make sure to leave a like. If you would like a part 2, comment below your thoughts and subscribe for more videos like this one. See you in the next one.